Every time when we start an exhortation, I always kind of look for a topic. Sometimes, it's something that I've been thinking about or something that, we went through in our readings, that type of thing. And so I thought for our exhortation this morning, we are going to take a look at the idea of the Jubilee in Leviticus. We're going to tie that in hopefully with the Psalms, and then hopefully tie it in with the Gospel of Luke, which we have been reading. So we're going to go from our first portion book to our second portion book to our New Testament reading. We'll see if it makes sense at the end of the day. We'll see. So this idea of Jubilee, the Jubilee was something very important when the children of Israel were just coming into the land and it was given out to different tribes. It was very important for that tribe to keep that land in its possession. And so we have a pretty elaborate and pretty in-depth process by which that land would stay in a particular family, number one, but also in a tribe. And so the question can be asked, brothers and sisters, why wasn't this idea of the Jubilee, instituted by the children of Israel, once they got into the land? And it's a couple things. Number one, like a lot of things, they didn't follow it. They decided it was too much hassle. I would imagine that a lot of the richer individuals there took over a lot of the land. We'll look at that in a second. But this was interesting too, in doing a little bit of research on the year of Jubilee. A lot of the rabbis interpreted the Jubilee as something that only applied to the children of Israel when the tribes controlled the land. In other words, there were certain areas of Israel that were designated for each tribe. But once after the fall of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and also the fall of the northern kingdoms by the Assyrians, they said that idea of the Jubilee has gone away. Okay, but I think we can take from the idea of Jubilee some spiritual lessons for sure, an idea of redemption. We'll take a look at this idea of redemption and how it plays an important part in the idea of the year of Jubilee and how that affects us. So let's take a look at a couple things. This was from Friday's readings in Leviticus, the 25th chapter. Let's just take a look at a couple of these things. In verse 13, in the year of this Jubilee ye shall return every man unto his possession. And if thou sell aught unto thy neighbor, or buyest aught of thy neighbor's hand, you shall not oppress one another. So that really is the foundational statement of the year of Jubilee. You were not to oppress each other. You weren't to take other people's possessions for you by force and make you're growing wealthy while your brother is growing poorer and poorer. They weren't to oppress each other. Verse 17, you shall not therefore oppress one another, but thou shalt fear thy God, for I am the Lord your God. Verse 23, the land shall not be sold forever, for the land is mine. Ye are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the land of your possession ye shall grant a redemption for the land. There was to be a way, brothers and sisters, for a Israelite that had fallen on hard times, that had, as the scripture says here, they'd waxen poor. In other words, for whatever reason, whether it was a bad business decision on the farm, maybe they had drought, maybe something had wiped out their fields for whatever reason. They had a chance to get that land back if they had to sell it in order to survive. In the 47th verse, verse 35, and if thy brother be waxen poor and fallen in decay with thee, then thou shalt relieve him. Yea, though he be a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with thee. Take thou no usury of him or increase, but fear thy God, that thy brother may live with thee. So they were to always be trying to help their neighbor. They weren't to oppress. They weren't to use the fact that one of their neighbors was going through hard times. Ooh, this is an opportunity for me. I can get their land as well. And then finally in verse 47, and if a sojourner or a stranger wax rich by thee, and thy brother that dwelleth by him wax poor, and sell himself unto the stranger or sojourner by thee, or to the stock of the stranger's family, after that he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brethren may redeem him. Either his uncle or his uncle's son may redeem him, or any that is nigh of kin unto him, or his family may redeem him. Or if he is able, he may redeem himself. So let's just kind of imagine this for a little bit, brothers and sisters, to kind of set the scene. Imagine being so poor and destitute that the only way to survive was to sell yourself into servitude. Not just yourself, but your wife, your children. You sold your very body into servitude in order to survive. This is what this chapter is talking about, brothers and sisters. And sometimes we can gloss over this, right? Like, oh, he's fallen on hard times. He's going to sell himself to somebody else. But think about the emotional ramifications of that, brothers and sisters. Selling your body, selling yourself to somebody else. Think about how destitute you would have to be in that situation. Think about your mindset in that situation. Think about maybe the despair that an individual would face, the lack of hope, the sadness, the internal conflict, right? The depression, maybe by a father that couldn't farm correctly. He made a mistake. Something happened. Think about the self-doubt that is involved in that. So anyways, we sometimes, when we can read words, but we need to internalize what these words mean. And so a lot of this stuff in the land, in this 25th chapter of Leviticus having to do with the Jubilee, it's really about destitute people. It's really about people that have fallen down on their luck. They're destitute. They have nothing left. And so just imagine you're this individual and you've sold yourself and your family to a stranger, not even to another Israelite, to a stranger, maybe an Egyptian that was living in the land. And so just imagine this situation, and all of a sudden a long-lost uncle shows up, or one of your kinsmen shows up, your cousin. And he says, whoa, 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 we got the money right here. We all pooled together our resources, and here we go. Here's the money. We're redeeming you. You're no longer a servant anymore. You're no longer a slave to this individual. You're free. You're back in the family. We've redeemed you from slavery. Think about the joy that would be involved in that. From despair to joy. All right, keep that in mind. Even though it was written in the law of Moses and they were supposed to follow it, the ancient Jews had trouble doing that, right? Just like we have trouble following after the commands of Christ sometimes. But anyways, in Nehemiah, there's an interesting story or event that does go hand in hand with this. I'm in the wrong area. Nehemiah. Here we go. All right, Nehemiah chapter 5. The chapter starts with these words. That's 4, this is 5. And there was a great cry of the people and of their wives against their brethren the Jews. For there were that said, we are sons, and our daughters are many. Therefore we take up corn for them, that we may eat and live. Some also there were that said, we have mortgaged our lands, vineyards, and houses, that we might buy corn because of the dearth. There were also that said, we have borrowed money for the king's tribute, and that upon our lands and our vineyards. Yet now our flesh is at the flesh of our children as their children, and lo, we bring into bondage our sons and our daughters to be servants, and some of our daughters are brought unto bondage already. Neither is it in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and vineyards. And so this was a major issue, brothers and sisters, that the Jews were dealing with once they came back into the land under Ezra and Nehemiah. There was a discrepancy between the very, very poor and the very, very rich. And so the rich were accumulating vineyards and fields and wealth, all at the backs of their poorer brothers and sisters. And so even though they had this very clear instruction, right, about the land of Jubilee, about the year of Jubilee, and this idea of redeeming something, it wasn't happening even under the direction of Nehemiah. It wasn't Nehemiah's fault because he's going to jump in and rectify this situation, saying that behavior shouldn't be allowed at all. So we'll turn to the 140th Psalm, the Psalm that Gordon read. Gordon, excellent job, by the way, even though I told Sharon 139. I was off by one. But you did great. All right, Psalm 140. Kind of keep in mind some of the things we've been talking about here, right? Jubilee, being distraught, being sold into, your whole family being sold into slavery. Deliver me, O Lord, from the evil man. Preserve me from the violent man. Verse 11, let not an evil speaker be established in the earth. Evil shall hunt the violent man to overthrow him. I know that the Lord will maintain the cause of the afflicted and the right of the poor. Surely the righteous shall give thanks unto thy name. The upright shall dwell in thy presence. We have a lot of these psalms, don't we, brothers and sisters, about David or another psalmist pleading with God for deliverance. Almost like reminding God or giving God a play-by-play about what is going on. Do you see all these wicked people around me? Do you see what I'm dealing with, Lord? Deliver me, he cries. In this idea, he says, I know that God will help the poor. He will help the afflicted. Right? And isn't that a tenet in the Old Testament, brothers and sisters, about God helping those that were poor, the fatherless and the widow? How many times do we hear that in the Old Testament? How many times do we hear that in the New Testament? That they were not to forget about the poor, or the stranger, the fatherless, or the widow. All the people that had very little voice in society, the downtrodden, the weakest. God looked out for them. And if God cared about the poor, then the lesson to the Jews at this time was, you should care about the poor as well. This idea, let's take a look at this idea of redemption, right, in the Psalms. In the 49th Psalm. In verse 7. Well, verse 6, right? This is interesting. They that trust in their wealth and boast themselves in the multitude of their riches, none of them can by any means redeem his brother, nor give to God a ransom for him, for the redemption of their souls is precious, and it ceases forever. So that's interesting that the psalmist here is recognizing, there are people with all kinds of wealth, but they wouldn't redeem their brother when they were in need. They refused to redeem their brother, refused to give of anything that they had. Right? And so that's one aspect of an individual. That's one human being. Has tremendous amount of resources, tremendous amount of wealth, but refuses to help their destitute brother. Okay? Hopefully there's a counterbalance to that. I think there is, and we'll look at that in a little bit. The 107th Psalm. I don't want to overload you with Psalms here, but there's a couple of them we need to look at. In the 107th Psalm, in verse 6, they that cried unto the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them out of their distresses. And he led them forth by the right way, that they might go to a city of habitation. Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. For he satisfies the longing soul and fills the hungry soul with goodness. Again, the character of God, brothers and sisters. What does he do? He satisfies the longing soul and fills the hungry with goodness. Let's take a look at Isaiah, the 44th chapter. In verse 21. This is God through Isaiah kind of pleading with the children of Israel, right? Pleading with them. Come back to me, he says. Remember these, O Jacob and Israel, for thou art my servant. I have formed thee. Thou art my servant, O Israel, that thou shalt not be forgotten of me. I have blotted out as a thick cloud the transgressions, and as a cloud thy sins. Return unto me, for I have redeemed you. God had redeemed his people. And he keeps over and over again through the prophets telling them, come back to me, come back to me. I've redeemed you. You don't have to follow after your old master. I've redeemed you. Come back into the fold. Come back into the family of God, he pleads with his people. Jeremiah talks about this as well in Lamentations, this idea of redemption. And it's actually about an event in Jeremiah's life that wasn't great. I mean, he had a lot of not so great events in his life. But in the 3rd chapter of Lamentations, beginning in the 55th verse. So verse 53, right? They have cut off my life in the dungeon and cast the stone upon me. Waters flowed over my head. Then I said, I am cut off. Well, what is Jeremiah talking about here? Well, he's talking about the event recorded in Jeremiah about when he was put into the prison, down into the prison where, water and sewerage he slowly sunk into the mire, right? Remember that story? And then he was drawn out by, I forget his name. Say again? Ebed-Melech, thank you, Brother Jim. Remember, they got the rotted clothes and everything, and they made a rope out of him, put it underneath his armpits and everything. It's this great story, but Jeremiah talks about it here. He's talking about the waters covering his head, right? I called upon the name of thy name, O Lord, out of the low dungeon. Thou hast heard my voice. Hide not thine ear at my breathing. At my cry, thou drewest near in the day that I called upon thee. Thou said, fear not. O Lord, thou hast pleaded the cause of my soul. Thou hast redeemed my life. And so that's the way Jeremiah looked at it, right? He looked at it as God redeeming him from certain death in the pit, from certain death in the waters of that dungeon. So what brings us, brothers and sisters, to the Gospel of Luke. In one particular chapter, it's the 8th chapter of Luke. And Luke is my favorite gospel, maybe because I have affinity. He was a history guy, right? He was a historian, writing things down. He was also a doctor as well. But he has a lot of information in the Gospel of Luke, right? A lot of detail, which is great. But the 8th chapter of Luke, and we won't, get into it too much. But this was Friday's reading as well. But there's just a couple things that we're going to take a look at. He gives the parable of the sower, right? We're not going to look at that. That's another exhortation for another time. Let's see. Yeah, in verse 26. And they arrived at the country of the Gadarenes, which is over against Galilee. And when he went forth to land, there met him out of a city a certain man which had devils long time, and didn't wear any clothes. He didn't live in the house. He was in the tombs. And it gives a little more information in verse 29. For oftentimes it had caught him, and he was kept bound with chains and in fetters, and he brake the bands and was driven of the devil into the wilderness. It's such kind of like a vivid painting that Luke is trying to, paint for us, the story. This guy was no clothes, just, mental illness probably, who knows, but violent. They would try to chain him up. They couldn't chain him. And it's kind of a metaphor in my mind, brothers and sisters. Legion, this guy right here, it's kind of a metaphor of our human nature, uncontrolled human nature. And we try to control it. We try to clothe it. We try to chain it. We try to talk to it, to reason. Won't reason. It won't stay chained. It's wild. It's uncontrollable. Think about the violence associated with this guy too, trying to chain a guy like this, okay? And they got the chains on him, but he broke it off. Think about how many people, men, that he hurt during this whole process, the use of violence, right? He was such an outcast, he was living in the tombs, like the lowest of the low. And Christ is going to heal this man. And so it's kind of a great visual, right? Let's see. Yeah, in verse 35, then they went out to see what was done, and came to Jesus and found the man out of whom the devils were departed, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed in his right mind. Right? Isn't that, such a great, like compare and contrast, right? And you know that in school, they give you something, you're going to compare and contrast it. So, you have on the one hand a chained up, uncontrollable individual, right? Then you have Christ. And then you have this individual sitting at the feet of Christ in his right mind. He's clothed now. He's civilized. Christ has taken away his struggle, right? He's sitting at Christ. He's calm. It's such a change, right? And so that's the redemptive power of Christ right there, right? By his healing hand, he redeemed this individual out of a life of misery. And so this chapter goes on and it talks about, the faithful woman, right? Horrible medical condition for 12 years. And we're told of her face, she's crawling on her hands and knees in the great crowd just to touch the hem of his garment. And in that one action, Christ redeemed this woman from a life of misery. And she was whole. Christ makes us whole, brothers and sisters, through the redemptive nature of his sacrifice. He redeemed us, all of us, by his own blood, by his own body. And then lastly, we have Jairus' daughter, a 12-year-old girl, just her whole life in front of her, and it's taken. And all of the hopes and dreams of Jairus and his wife, are just laying there. And Christ redeemed the daughter by his power. Redeemed the family from a life of misery, of sadness, of despair. And that is the redemptive power of Christ. And so all of these things, pulling all of these things together, Paul's going to talk about this. Just a couple more scriptures here in Colossians, in the first chapter of Colossians, in verse 13. Verse 12. Giving thanks unto the Father, which hath made us meet to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light, who hath delivered us from the power of darkness, and hath translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son, in whom we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins. You see the imagery Paul is using here, brothers and sisters? The light of God and the darkness of this world. And it was Christ that brought about the light. Remember in Legion, right? He's in the tombs, violent man, sitting on the right hand of God, Christ after he's healed. So we'll end with a couple quotes here, brothers and sisters, from Peter. You know, think about the relationship that Peter had with Christ. He would have seen all of these redemptive acts, you know, of healing, the compassion and empathy of Christ. He would have saw all this. He saw the first-hand accounts of the great power, redemptive power of his master. In verse 18, forasmuch as ye know that ye were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold, from your vain conversation received by traditions from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. And so he says that's a fact. Given that you believe this fact, that we have been redeemed by the precious blood of Christ, he asks the question, what types of individuals should we be? Verse 22, seeing ye have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the love through the Spirit, unto unfeigned love of the brethren, see that you love one another with a pure heart, fervently. And then we can turn and close with a couple verses from the second chapter of 1 Peter, where he says in verse 21, for even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that ye should follow his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judges righteously, who his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, being dead to sins, should live unto righteousness, by whose stripes you are healed.